The topic of this talk is top mistakes developers make in publisher relationships. My name is David Rosenbaum. I am a partner in the Interactive Entertainment Law Group. My partner, Patrick Sweeney, was originally scheduled to make this presentation, but due to a scheduling conflict, he couldn't be here today. At our firm, we are primarily a firm that represents clients in the video game space, developers, publishers, technology licensing, mergers and acquisitions in the space, and licensing of brands, characters, sports properties, and whatnot. I've been representing clients or doing deals in the video game space since the mid-1980s, and over the course of that time, I've represented probably 60 or 70 different development studios, and you probably won't be surprised that in the sort of evolution of game development, about 2/3 of those companies are no longer in business for various reasons, probably because they didn't attend this lecture. So with that, these are common mistakes that are made. It's not, the phrase common sense doesn't always apply when you're talking about a developer-publisher relationship or what makes a good contract. One reason why developers accept contracts is desperation. They need money. They're passionate about a project and they want to get it made. They'll tell you that a cardinal rule in contract negotiation is that there's no deal you can't walk away from, and yet for startup developers or young developers who fear that they will never talk to another publisher again if they don't accept this deal, it creates drama that you really can avoid. You have to go in understanding that most publisher-developer deals are not even-handed propositions, and some of them are really unfair. Publishers have money, developers have talent. Until you demonstrate the talent, the publisher's money will outweigh your talent in terms of how the contracts are going to be written. Another thing is, don't go into this contract thinking you know everything. Understand that there are things you don't know. Understand that you lack experience in certain areas, and don't shy away from those things. Publishers are, when they're hiring a developer, they're doing a sales job on you. This is the first of many projects we're going to do together. Of course, we have your best interests in mind. Well, the fact of the matter is, the publisher is looking out for the publisher. They want a game out at a certain time, and the developer needs to also look out for the developer to make sure you can navigate that contract, get the game out, do the support you need, and then move on to your next project relatively unscathed, and perhaps making a few dollars in the process. Understand that games are a business. Not looking, you have to look at the business realities. The publisher doesn't care if your game is the most avant-garde game of the year. They want to make money, and you want to have that same goal as well. Again, these are kind of general concepts that you should be aware of. Some of them seem pretty self-evident, but often in the heat of a contract negotiation, they get lost in the mix. Oftentimes you see miscommunication and differing exceptions. You agree to terms without fully understanding the meaning of what they are. And if you're a developer outside of the US and English is a second language, trying to negotiate a contract in the English language can be a challenge. And don't feel like, if your English is not good, that you can't get help and make sure that the contract is properly drafted. So, mistake number one, not getting your ducks in a row. Organize your business. If you look at two different developers, one has a great concept and some talent and three guys with an idea, and that's it. The other developer has a good concept, has a roadmap to get there, has a good internal and external business team. That second developer is likely to get a deal before you will, because publishers are looking at you to see, do you run your business like a business, or are you 4 or 5 people working in a garage making your passion project? The publisher needs to understand and trust that you have the resources to deliver the product. And so when you start off, and since a number of you are already formed companies, But some basics: choose your business entity. Decide whether you want to be a limited liability company, a corporation, a partnership, but make those decisions. Consult with an attorney, consult with a tax advisor. Get your organizational docs in order so that your company has a firm footing. Make a budget for your game. Have a resource plan. Understand that you know what it's going to cost to run your company, so don't pitch for a project where the publisher is only going to pay half of your run rate. Or if you do, make sure you've got some financing to cover the balance. Then also important is not only your internal organization, but your business team. If you're starting out, you won't have an agent or you won't have a business development person in-house, so you really want to look for an agent or someone with business development experience who can help you understand the business realities of a deal and also make introductions and introduce you to publishers and parties that would be interested in buying your game. Shameless plug, you need to hire a lawyer. But you should look for a lawyer with experience in games and entertainment transactions, not a real estate lawyer or your family's trust and estate lawyer. An accountant. You want to have an accountant who can advise you on your financial performance and help manage your financial records and pay taxes. You want a staffing solution. You probably aren't joining the company with an HR director in mind, which means one of you and one of the founders is automatically designated, gets the short straw, and is now the HR director. So these are things that you need to consider and how that will help you get a deal or not. And again, these are some things. If you have an agent, or if you have a lawyer who's got experience in the game space, and you have a good accountant, and you tell the publisher these are the people who advise you, that also raises your credibility level, and it puts you in a better position to negotiate a more favorable deal. But be careful about that. More favorable doesn't mean more money, doesn't mean a better royalty split or recoupment. It just means a deal that you can navigate without having your business go into bankruptcy. The second mistake that's commonly made is not fully speccing out your project and going into a deal with too many unknowns and too many intangibles. You need to create a roadmap. Lay out the specs ahead of time. If you're making a free-to-play premium game that requires live support, then you have to plan for that. The game's going to launch, and you're going to have resources to support the game, develop content, fix bugs, and monetize the game and have community management and all those things. And if you're the developer, you need to budget for that, and you need to prepare for that, and be able to ramp up and ramp down in a way that doesn't wreck your finances. You want to identify if you need any licenses. If you're making a music game and your game depends on licensing music, let's say for a karaoke game, you have to understand what that's going to cost. You have to know someone who can help you go to music publishers and clearinghouses and get licenses, and you have to add that to your budget because it's a cost of the game. When you make your pitch document is a sales document, so it's going to make all sorts of promises. But oftentimes what happens is the publisher will put that pitch doc as an exhibit to the contract, and you've promised that the game will be fun, and you've promised it'll be revolutionary, and it'll be bigger than the last game. And if the publisher is inexperienced and is unhappy with the game, they're going to say, you promised the game would be fun, and it's not, and we're not going to pay you, and you should give us our money back because we think you're in breach. So it's a double-edged sword. You want your pitch document to get the deal, but you don't want to overpromise so that if you have a publisher that doesn't have good producing resources, blames you for all the problems. Also assume that no game goes smoothly. Assume that there'll be delays. Assume there'll be delays in acceptance, in payments. Also, publishers, when they look at a project, they may say, you know, this game might benefit from a shift in direction or adding some content. When you hear those words, you need to say to yourself, okay, this means more money, It's going to cost me more money to do it. You're going to extend the project by a month or 2 months or 3 months, and we need to be paid for that. Not every development contract would provide for that. It'll say you'll make all these changes and you're going to deliver the game for X dollars, and if there's overages, you're on the hook. You, the developer, are on the hook for those expenses. So you want to be able to have change order language in your agreement so that there's a process for you and the publisher to talk about what they want and how it's going to get done efficiently, and if it's going to require resources, what that's going to cost. You want to try and get objective milestone approval language in your contract, but more often than not, it's going to say the publisher has the right to approve what you deliver in their sole discretion. So you have to learn how to manage publisher expectations and how to navigate potentially rocky waters that surround your product. Benefits to being prepared. It puts you and the publisher on the same page. It doesn't mean you're equal partners, but at least you understand their expectations and they understand that you thought out the process, and it should make the process go quicker if you understand how they're going to approve things, how much time they're going to take, and if they have to get approvals from upper management and how that's going to affect the project. Typically, as I said, these are at the publisher's discretion. This language that you see here, each milestone delivered will be subject to a publisher approval in their sole discretion. That's typical. I always try and add not to be unreasonably withheld, try and put some time limits in there so that the publisher gets back to you within a certain time period so you can manage expectations. Oftentimes I see contracts that my clients send to me that the game is going to take 18 months to develop, and the publishing agreement says that the publisher, and it's 18 monthly milestones, and the publisher has 30 days to approve each milestone. The publisher takes the full 30 days, then the contract isn't an 18-month contract, but it's a 36-month contract, and you're only being paid for 18. So you need to be realistic and understand that just because that contract says 30 days, you can't ask for less, or you shouldn't ask for less. Because clearly, publishers want to get their games out on time, and if the publisher is a publicly traded company, they've promised games to their shareholders, and if they miss their deadlines, that affects their stock price. So you want to understand all of these things so that if you're stuck with a clause that says that the approval is discretionary, you know how to manage that, and you have a relationship with your producer at the publisher that will facilitate ease of approvals. Also, you want to make sure that you have language which requires a conversation if the scope of the project changes. What you see here, and I guess what will be available online afterwards, is a pretty typical clause which basically says, you developer will try first to make a change at no additional cost, but if you reasonably believe it's going to require additional manpower or additional assets or additional licenses, that the parties will then sit down and negotiate changes to the schedule and changes to the compensation that you need to be paid in order to implement and execute on these changes. Oftentimes you'll see a contract that says you will start making the changes while we negotiate your additional your additional compensation. You should resist that. It should be clear that you're not going to start work on a change order until there's some meeting of the minds on what it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. Also, in terms of delays, if you're doing a licensed game for a publisher on a work-for-hire basis, and that license depends on approvals from a third party, say you're doing a World Cup soccer game, and your publisher has to go to get approvals from FIFA, you have to understand how that's going to affect your timeliness of your game. If your game depends on FIFA delivering to the publisher team player likenesses, team approved artwork, approved signage, approved stadium looks, and all of that, you need to make sure that those materials get delivered in time for you to deliver the milestone that says you're going to show all the implementation of the FIFA licensed signage and trademarks and whatnot. And you need to provide that if there are delays by the publisher, that extends the project, that extends your milestone schedule so you're not late. And it also triggers a change order discussion because, okay, this game has to be out before the World Cup starts, but now you've added 2 months of extra work. So in order to squeeze that in, we need to hire 10 people, and someone needs to pay for that. So these are the things you have to sort of keep in mind as you are navigating the project. IP ownership. In a typical deal where the publisher is going to own the game, it's considered, you all have heard the word work for hire. Publisher is going to own the finished product, but that game has component parts which a developer needs to maintain the ownership of and which are copyrightable assets to the developer. So you need to understand that what you own and what the publisher owns at the end of the day, you need to be able to continue to run your business and develop new games after your deal with this publisher is over and you've moved on to try and develop games for other publishers or to self-publish. All your tools and tech. Those are separate components that go into games and are reusable. And if you sign a contract which gives the publisher ownership of your tools and tech, you have nothing to reuse, and then you contractually will have to, you've agreed by contract that your next game will have different tools and tech that you spent a lot of money developing, when in reality, you need to continue to use those tools and tech for all of your games. Holding on to this is important because, you need, as I said, you need to be able to continue your business after your deal ends. It also deals with a gotcha-in contracts, which are non-competes. Typically, if you're doing a game for a publisher in a certain genre, they're going to want you to agree that for a period of time, you won't develop a similar game or an identical game, that can range from a year to 3 years, or sometimes, some contracts will be written as a perpetual non-compete. And in reality, you need to sort of take a look at the fine print and say, okay, I'll agree, since you're paying me a royalty, and I think this game is going to be a hit, I'll agree to give you a year or 2 years in which I won't release a competing game. But you have to understand that, and even though it's buried in the fine print of the contract, that you anticipate the problem and you come to some internal decision about how long you're willing to stay out of the marketplace with a competing game. Here's a typical clause that you would find, that the contract will say the publisher owns everything, and then it'll say, notwithstanding, the developer retains its rights in its tools, and the tools are usually a defined concept. And make sure that the term tools includes your know-how. All of your sort of residual and retained memory and retained learning about what you do, that's a valuable asset, and you don't want to be restricted from reusing your own know-how. So this is a clause that you would see typically that would protect the developer in allowing them to continue to do their work. Non-competes. This particular clause is completely over the top, and we've put it in here for, to emphasize the point. You want to give the publisher a selling season. In the console days, you want to make, it would be getting through 1 or 2 Christmas periods because those are the big selling seasons. And with mobile games, the seasonality is a little less important, but there will still be a period of time in which you won't release a competing game, and worse, you won't reskin the game and release something else during the same time period. It doesn't work for you if you're getting a royalty to release a competing game that's going to cannibalize the sales, and you won't endear yourself to the publisher in terms of getting further work on the next project. Which brings us to another common mistake, is dealing with termination and how to transition away. Bad things can happen in development, and you have to be prepared to have your contract or the project terminated. And every game development contract is going to give the publisher or the company that's paying for the game the right to terminate the game for any reason or for no reason, and not just because you're delayed or you're in breach. It's called a cancellation for convenience. It's the clause that when other lawyers who don't do game work very often look at that and say, why would any developer agree to that? Well, that's a standard provision in the game development world, that you risk having your game canceled at any time for any reason. So you have to plan that for the likelihood of that, and how much of a runway do you need in order to keep your company afloat while you pitch your next project. A rule of thumb used to be that it takes 6 months. If you depend on publisher work, it's going to take you 6 months to negotiate a new contract and start work on a new game, and you've got a payroll to meet for 6 months. So how do you deal with that in the contract? You try and fight for some sort of kill fee. Usually they'll say, we'll pay you for the work that's been approved, and we'll say our goodbyes, and that's it. And you're going to say, well, wait a second, you have to give me some notice, and I have a runway to meet, and I have a transition, so that I need to be able to pay my team and keep them on staff, and then get a new project. So, what happens then? What do you want to do? You want to try and get some payment from the publisher that will give you some cash, help you with your cash flow in the short term. But then there's also issues about what happens to the game concept if the deal is canceled. Do you get it back? Typically you don't, but you may want to ask for the option to buy the game back, or to try and set the project up at another publisher. Do you get any compensation if the game is canceled when it's nearly finished and someone else finishes it? You need to make sure that if you've developed the game to a certain point, that even though they've canceled the project, if they release the game, you'll get some revenue on a royalty rev share basis. In terms of free-to-play games that are monetized with in-app purchases and require live support, if they terminate your services, they have to then make arrangements for a new live team, or you have to negotiate some sort of transition, perhaps sunsetting the game, some sort of transition that will give you some cash flow while the game is being sunsetted, and give you some cushion while you look for your next project. So you want to plan for everything, and you want to plan for the worst. I know that sounds counterintuitive. You want to hope the project's going to be a killer project and the game is going to be the greatest thing since the last greatest thing. But more often than not, you'll find the cancellation scenario more prevalent than the hit game. So you need to prepare for that, or you're closing your company down, or you're laying off your staff, or you're doing things that become really unpleasant and can make the culture at your company toxic. So, again, here's what we're sort of running out of time, but this reinforces what I've been talking about, and this would be a typical thing that you would see in a contract, that the publisher has the discretion to terminate the title without cause or reason. So you want to make sure you're paid for all the work you've done. You want to get paid for the milestone in progress. And you usually will ask for some sort of kill fee, a couple of milestone payments, a couple of the milestones ahead to give you some cash flow. Publishers are resisting that, and more they're refusing to pay any sort of additional compensation other than the milestone in progress. So if that's the case, then you have to determine whether you have cash reserves that could help you weather the turbulence. Here's another example of transitioning. What happens if the game has already been released? There'll be a wind down period, and this might set the table for how the relationship will end peacefully. And sometimes you say, if the game you've developed for the publisher is your original idea and not based on a license, you'd want the option to try and set the game up with another publisher. Oftentimes, publishers will let you do that, provided that the next publisher pays them back for what they paid you. So that gets a little tricky, but if you think you can set the game up somewhere else, then you should try and do that. Other common mistakes: ignore the myths and keep an eye on the fine print of the contract. If you're negotiating with a business development person who's not a lawyer, they'll tell you, this is our standard contract and we don't make any changes. What that means is we're giving you our entry-level contract that is the most one-sided in our favor, and everybody signs it, and you should be no different. But the fact is, you can do better. And most publishers, if they recognize that you have any sort of track record or any sort of level of experience, will capitulate on that and will make changes that will allow you to successfully navigate potential problems. You're not going to get more money. You're not going to get a better royalty rate than what the publisher's ROI analysis says is appropriate, because they want to make a profit too, and your profit is less important to them than their profit. But you want to be able to go at the provisions that relate to approvals, that relate to ownership of your tools, that relate to what happens in a cancellation, that relates to things like credit, so that these are important issues that help you keep your company alive after the contract ends and help you grow your company. You want to be able to get credit for your work. You want to be able to audit the publisher's books and records, and you want to make sure that that's there. Credit is important, and don't minimize, the fact that you may have a splash screen at the beginning of the game, and that shows your company logo, and that tells the world who you are. But if you're any developer, you have a website, you want to be able to put on your website what you're working on, and oftentimes publishers won't let you do that, so you have to argue for that. You can say, look, when you issue a press release, I ought to be able to, that says we're a developer, I ought to be able to put that on my website so that people can see we're working for X publisher. If you don't ask for it, you won't get it. And these are kinds of things that these are the kinds of things that are important to the long-term growth of your studio, and you shouldn't, minimize them because a publisher is giving you a hard time. You want to be able to put on your website that you have publishing partners, that, you work with 6 or 7 different publishers, so you want to make sure you have the right to do that. It's called boilerplate, but it really is a lot of the standard clauses that are in any sort of contract, whether it's a game development contract or a contract to purchase a home or a contract for widgets. So you want to make sure that these standard terms are mutual, so that then these are things like confidentiality and warranties and indemnity. What happens if things go wrong? So you want to look at that. And you want to make sure that you have a lawyer who can advise you on where to make these changes, because these are the things that the publisher may or may not care about, but you have to lobby for them in order to protect your company going forward. Here's an example of some standard audit language. Usually it's once a year, and if you get a royalty statement, they'll tell you can only audit it once. So you want to be careful that there's some time here. Oftentimes, you will see that you have a certain limited period of time in which to audit books. In most states, statute of limitations on a contract claim can run 4 years or more. Oftentimes, you'll see in a publishing agreement, you have 6 months from when we issue you a royalty statement to demand an audit. And there's a reason for that, but you need to make sure that you have more time than 6 months, because you're not going to know how the game is doing unless it's a hit from the get-go. So you want at least a year or 2 in order to audit the books and records, and it'll give you a more accurate picture of the way the game is performed. And we're out of time. Here's an example of some credit language, and we have time for a question or 2.
We have time for, actually, it looks like we're out of time. Wealth of information. Thank you so much, and I know you'll be around. So can we have a round of applause, please? Thank you.